I was sitting in the waiting room, the faint smell of disinfectant in the air, when my phone rang. The voice on the other end was my son's. Short, cold, final. Mom, I sold the cabin, and Dad's Chevy too. Lydia and I need the money for our startup. We're leaving for California tomorrow. Click. The line went dead. Before I tell you what happened next, I'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching this story from? How would you feel if your own child made that call? Please share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so we can keep growing together. Your voice matters here. My name is Martha Williams. I'm 68 years old, a retired school librarian, and a widow. 1 year ago, my husband Frank died in his sleep. He had spent 43 years by my side raising our son David, fixing old cars in the driveway, and saving every penny he could. When Frank passed, I thought the worst pain of my life had already come and gone. I was wrong. The cabin David sold wasn't just wood and nails. It sat on the edge of Lake Michigan, where Frank taught David how to fish, where we lit bonfires under summer stars, where generations of birthdays and Christmas mornings were carved into those walls. The Chevy, an old '69 Frank had babied for decades, still carried his scent in the cracked leather seats. To me, those things weren't property. They were pieces of him. So when David's voice cut through the silence of that waiting room, it wasn't the loss of money that stunned me. It was the chill, the way he spoke as if I were just another obstacle in his plans. For 42 years, I believed my son's heart still carried the warmth of our family. That day, I learned how wrong I had been. I put the phone back in my purse. Around me, people coughed. A nurse called another patient's name. My chest should have tightened, but instead a strange calm settled over me. I didn't cry, not even a tear. My lips curved into a smile that surprised even me. Because David thought he had taken everything. He thought I was left with nothing. But my dear son never knew the truth. You see, Frank was never the type to talk about money. He wore flannel shirts until the elbows gave out, drove his truck until the tires balded, and told everyone we lived on modest savings. But 3 days before his heart gave out, he pressed a manila envelope into my hands. "Put this in your dresser drawer," he whispered. "If something ever happens to me, open it when you're ready." I had tucked it away and forgotten. Until that call. As I sat under the fluorescent light of that waiting room, I remembered. And for the first time in a year, I felt something stronger than grief: determination. My son had no idea that the mother he thought he had outsmarted was holding more cards than he could ever imagine. And that was the beginning. When I walked out of the clinic that afternoon, the Florida sun was sharp, almost blinding, but inside me there was only shadow. I drove the bus back home, my car, my independence, all that was left to me after Frank's passing. Yet every turn of the road reminded me of what David had just taken away. The cabin, the Chevy, 2 pieces of my life that carried more than memories. They carried the very soul of my marriage. Frank had been a Navy man before he became a truck driver. He used to joke that he had seen half the world by sea and the other half by asphalt. He was a quiet man, disciplined with hands rough from work, but gentle when he touched my face. When we bought that cabin on Lake Michigan, he said it was the first place he wanted that wasn't moving a place to anchor. For over 30 summers, it became the heart of our family. I can still see the screen door slamming as David ran out barefoot, a fishing rod, twice his height, wobbling in his grip. Frank would kneel at the dock, showing him how to bait the hook, his voice calm and steady like the lake itself. At night, we lit bonfires on the shore. Marshmallows, melting fireflies rising, and Frank strumming his guitar with a voice that never quite carried the tune, but carried us anyway. That cabin was more than wood and stone. It was proof that we belonged somewhere together. The Chevy was another story altogether. A 1969 Chevrolet deep green with chrome that Frank polished every Sunday morning. He kept it in a small garage away from salt air covering it like a prized possession. He called it my other child. David rolled his eyes whenever Frank brought it up, but I knew Frank hoped the car would one day belong to him. Every oil change, every wax job was a lesson in patience, pride, and care. Frank said machines like people lasted longer when they were respected. Now both were gone with one phone call. My son's voice had cut through decades of sacrifice, as if none of it had mattered. And yet, standing in my kitchen that evening, I realized the real loss wasn't the cabin or the car. It was trust. For years, I had told myself that no matter what, David was my anchor now, the one who would carry forward what Frank and I had built. Instead, he had treated it like loose change in his pocket. I poured myself a cup of tea, but it turned cold in my hands as my mind wandered through the years. I remembered sewing patches on David's jeans when money was tight, packing his lunches, waiting in parking lots for school events, stretching Frank's truck driver paychecks to cover college tuition. I remembered the arguments Frank and I had when David demanded more than we could afford: sneakers, trips, gadgets. I always gave in, believing love meant saying yes. Now, with every sacrifice replaying in my memory, I wondered if saying yes had been my biggest mistake. The silence of the house pressed in on me. Once it had been filled with the sound of Frank's boots at the door, his laughter booming as he retold road stories, his smell of motor oil and aftershave lingering in the hall. Without him, the walls felt empty. Without the cabin and the Chevy, it felt as if even the ghosts of our life together had been sold off. But I didn't collapse. Instead, something inside me hardened. I looked at Frank's framed photo on the mantel, him in uniform, younger, proud, unshaken, and I whispered, "They think we're broken, but we're not. You left me more than memories, didn't you?" The thought of that manila envelope burned brighter in my mind. I had not yet opened it, but suddenly I knew I would. Not out of desperation, but out of respect for Frank, for myself, for everything we had built. If David believed he had stripped me bare, he was about to discover how wrong he was. For the first time since Frank's funeral, I felt the air shift around me. I wasn't just a widow betrayed by her only child. I was a woman standing at the threshold of something new, something my son could never take away. And deep down, I felt Frank beside me, steady as ever, guiding me toward the drawer upstairs, where the truth waited to be unfolded. That night, I climbed the stairs slowly, each step heavier than the last. The house creaked under my weight the same way it always had, but tonight the sound felt different, like the house itself was waiting with me. Upstairs in the bedroom Frank and I had shared for over 4 decades, the dresser stood in its usual place by the window. I opened the drawer, and there it was, the manila envelope. Its edges were a little worn now, the paper slightly yellowed, as if time itself had been guarding it. My hands trembled when I picked it up. For a moment I pressed it against my chest, breathing in, as though the envelope still carried Frank's scent of aftershave and motor oil. I could almost hear his voice. "Only when you're ready, Martha." I sat on the edge of the bed, the same bed where he had kissed me goodnight thousands of times, and tore the seal. Inside were neatly stacked documents and a folded letter written in his careful handwriting. My eyes blurred before I even began to read. "My dearest Martha," it began. "If you are reading this, then I am no longer beside you. Forgive me for keeping secrets, but I wanted to protect you from worry. Over the years, I invested quietly our savings, my bonuses, every spare dollar. I wanted to make sure that no matter what, you would never be left with nothing." I pressed the letter to my lips, holding back tears. My Frank, who wore the same flannel shirts until they thinned, who brought home diner coffee instead of buying Starbucks, who always made life look simple. And yet all those years he had been quietly planning for me. The documents told the rest of the story. Deeds to properties I never knew existed, a row of rental houses in Ohio, a small gas station in Texas, even a downtown storage facility under an LLC I had never heard of. There were certificates of stock in a regional trucking company, bank statements with numbers that didn't seem real. I blinked, counted again. 6 figures, 7. My breath caught. Frank had been a truck driver, yes, but apparently also a strategist, an investor, a man who saw possibilities where I saw only limitations. He had built a fortune in silence, never boasting, never even hinting. The room spun as I tried to absorb it. For a year, I had let the world look at me as the poor widow pitied by neighbors, underestimated by even my own son. I had believed that narrative myself, But here in my lap was proof that I was not helpless. I was not abandoned. I was, in fact, a wealthy woman. I laughed softly through my tears. It wasn't the giddy laugh of someone winning the lottery. It was quieter, deeper, the laugh of someone realizing they had been underestimated all along. David thought he had taken everything. He thought selling the cabin and the Chevy stripped me of my past, but Frank had given me more than memories. He had given me power, and with that power came choice. I closed the envelope and placed it gently on the bedspread. For the first time since Frank's funeral, I didn't feel like I was standing on sinking ground. I felt anchored again, but in a new way. I wasn't just holding on to the past, I was holding the future in my hands. Downstairs, the house was silent, but I swear I could feel Frank's presence in the walls steadying me. He hadn't left me alone. He had left me prepared. And that night, as I turned off the light, one thought burned bright in my mind. My son believed I was broken. He had no idea I was just getting started. The next morning, I woke with the envelope still on the nightstand beside me. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, cutting lines across the documents that had changed everything. I knew I couldn't keep this to myself forever. Frank had trusted me to handle it, and I needed someone who could guide me through the legal maze. There was only one man I could think of, Richard Harris, a lawyer in town. But to me, he was more than that. He had served alongside Frank in the Navy back when they were young men sailing waters half a world away. They had stayed friends through the decades, though Harris had traded uniforms for suits, while Frank traded them for denim and diesel. When I walked into his office, the smell of leather and old books settled around me. Harris rose from behind his desk, his hair silver now, but his handshake still firm. "Martha," he said warmly, "Frank always told me you were the stronger half of the two of you. It's good to see you." I slid the envelope across the desk. "Frank left me this," I said quietly. "I opened it last night." He adjusted his glasses and began to read. I watched his brow furrow, then lift in surprise. "Martha, do you realize what you're holding here?" "I'm beginning to," I whispered. He laid out the papers. Deed stocks, bank accounts, studying each with the sharp eye of a man who had seen hundreds of estates. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. "Everything is legitimate. Frank was meticulous. He must have spent years structuring this. And as for the cabin, David had no legal right to sell it. His signature isn't worth the ink on the page." I closed my eyes, relief and sorrow tangling inside me. "So I could get it back easily," Harris said. "We can nullify the sale and restore ownership to you. If you wanted, we could even press charges for fraud." For a moment, I imagined it dragging David into court, watching him explain his betrayal under oath. A part of me longed for that justice, but another part, deeper and quieter, whispered no. That wasn't Frank's way. And maybe it wasn't mine either. "I don't want to take him to court," I said finally. "I want him to learn, to feel what it means to throw away trust. A lesson harsher than any judge could give." Harris studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "Frank always said you had more grit than you let on. If you want to handle this quietly, I'll support you. But you don't have to carry it alone." He was right. I needed someone close, someone I could lean on when the nights grew heavy. That's when I thought of Evelyn. Evelyn had been my neighbor for 30 years, the kind of woman who knew when to knock with a plate of cookies and when to simply wave from her porch. She had been there after Frank's funeral, sitting beside me in silence, when words felt empty. If anyone could help me keep my balance now, it was her. That evening, I invited her over. She listened as I told her everything David's call, the envelope, Harris's revelation. Her eyes widened and she shook her head slowly. "Martha, I knew Frank was a good man, but this is something else. And you're David. How could he?" I shrugged, feeling both broken and unbreakable. "Because he doesn't know who I really am, but he's about to." Evelyn reached for my hand, squeezing it. "Then I'll stand with you. Whatever lesson you decide to teach you won't teach it alone." And that night, sitting with my oldest friend, I realized something. I wasn't just a widow anymore. I was a woman with allies, with choices, with power. David thought he had won, but the truth was the game had only just begun. Weeks passed after my meeting with Mr. Harris, and I kept my silence. Evelyn checked in often, reminding me that patience sometimes delivers a sharper justice than any courtroom ever could. I carried on with my days, watering the garden, attending church on Sundays, baking pies for the ladies' circle, outwardly the same widow everyone thought they knew. But inside, I was different, stronger, waiting. News of David and Lydia drifted back to me in fragments carried by social media posts and the occasional call from an old family friend. They had packed up for California with smiles, stretched wide, posting photos of palm trees and rented convertibles. New beginnings, the captions read. They boasted about a technology startup calling themselves pioneers of something revolutionary. I didn't understand the jargon, but I understood arrogance. At night, I sat with Evelyn on the porch. She scrolled through her phone, showing me pictures David had shared. "Look here," she said, tilting the screen toward me. "They're celebrating with champagne like they've struck gold." I forced a smile. "Let them," I whispered. "The higher they climb, the harder they'll fall." And fall they did. It began with whispers. A man who claimed to be their investor disappeared, taking their seed money with him. Calls went unanswered, contracts unraveled. By the time David realized the business partner was gone, leaving behind only empty promises and unpaid bills. Lydia's smile faded from the photos, replaced by silence. Then came the final blow she left him. One day she was his wife. The next she was on the arm of another man, a wealthy entrepreneur with real money in his pocket. When I heard, I didn't feel triumph. I felt the kind of sorrow only a mother can feel watching her child stumble into a pit you warned him about, but he insisted wasn't there. Soon after the phone rang. I knew his voice before he said my name, Mom. David whispered, hollow, broken, "I need to see you." I closed my eyes, steadying myself. "Are you back in Florida?" "Yes. I lost everything. Lydia's gone. The bank is after me. I don't have anywhere else to go." The silence stretched between us. I thought of Frank, of the envelope of Harris and Evelyn, of the cabin that was rightfully mine. I thought of the boy who once held my hand at the county fair, the man who now saw me as a safety net. Finally, I answered, "Come tomorrow." When I hung up, Evelyn, who had been sitting quietly at my kitchen table, leaned forward. "So, he's crawling back." I nodded, though my chest ached. "Yes. But this time, he's not coming back to the same mother he left behind." That night, sleep didn't come easy. Memories pulled at me. David's first day of school, the way Frank lifted him onto his shoulders to watch fireworks, the laughter that used to fill our cabin by the lake. Love doesn't dissolve no matter how deep the betrayal. But love without boundaries becomes weakness, and I wasn't willing to be weak anymore. When morning light broke through the curtains, I stood at the window, coffee in hand, watching the quiet street. Somewhere out there, my son was driving toward me, stripped of pride, stripped of comfort, stripped of illusions. He thought he'd find refuge in the same old mother who always forgave, but he was about to learn that forgiveness doesn't mean rescue. Not this time. The next day, David stood on my porch. He looked smaller somehow, as though life itself had pressed him down. His clothes were wrinkled, his eyes hollow, and the swagger that once marked his every step had vanished. For a long moment, we simply stared at each other. Finally, I opened the door wider. "Come in," I said. He set his duffel bag down by the hallway, the same hallway he used to race through as a boy chasing the family dog. Now he moved slower, shoulders bent. He asked if he could stay. I nodded, but with a warning. "This house is not a refuge for laziness, David. If you stay here, you will work. You will earn your meals, your bed, and every ounce of trust you hope to rebuild." He agreed quickly, too quickly, as desperate men do. The next morning, I set the first challenge. "There's a warehouse on 5th Street, I told him. "They're hiring for heavy lifting. Go down there, start today." He blinked. "Manual labor, Mom, I haven't." "Then it's about time you start," I interrupted. "You wanted to play the big investor. Now you'll learn what real investment costs sweat." He left reluctantly, but he went. That night, he returned with blistered hands and a silence I hadn't heard from him in years. He ate his dinner without complaint, then fell asleep on the couch before the evening news. Over the following weeks, I pushed him further. When the warehouse cut hours, I found him a second job waiting tables at a diner on the edge of town. The same diner Frank and I had gone to every Friday night. David stood behind the counter now, balancing trays and swallowing his pride. I visited once, not to embarrass him, but to see if he would quit. He caught sight of me, his face flushed, but he didn't falter. He carried a tray of burgers to a family and forced a smile. It was the first glimmer of humility I'd seen in him in years. One evening after his shift, David asked if he could walk with me to church. It surprised me, but I said yes. Inside the small chapel, the light from stained glass windows painted the pews in colors. Pastor John, a kind man with silver hair and a voice both gentle and firm, greeted us. He had buried Frank had prayed with me when grief was fresh. Now he turned his attention to David. "Son," he said, resting a hand on his shoulder, "sometimes God allows us to lose what we thought mattered so we can finally see what truly does." David's lips tightened. "But I failed. I hurt her." He gestured toward me. Pastor John nodded. "Failure isn't the end. It's a beginning if you let it be. Responsibility isn't something you talk about, David. It's something you live day by day. And redemption, it isn't given cheap. It's earned." I watched my son's face as those words sank in. He didn't argue. He didn't deflect. He simply lowered his head as though for the first time in his life he understood. Walking home, the air cool around us, David finally spoke. "Mom, I never knew work could feel like this. Not just the pain, but the clarity. Every dollar feels different when you've carried boxes for it or smiled at strangers to earn a tip." I didn't answer right away. I let his words linger in the night air. Then I said quietly, "That's the lesson you should have learned years ago. And now, David, you're just beginning to understand." For the first time in months, I felt something stirring in me. Not forgiveness yet, but possibility. The weeks of labor began to wear on David. His shoulders slumped lower each evening, his hands rougher, his eyes heavier. The weight of debts, the sting of Lydia's betrayal, the endless grind of menial work, it all carved into him. I could see it breaking him down, but also shaping him into someone new. Still, there came a point when I knew it was time. Time to reveal what I had carried in silence. One Saturday morning, I told him to come with me. He didn't ask where we were going. Maybe he was too tired. Maybe he trusted me more than he realized. We drove into town past the diner where he worked, past the warehouse where he lifted boxes until we reached the tall brick building with Harris and Associates carved into the stone. "Why are we here?" David asked, unease flickering in his voice. "You'll see," I answered. Inside, Mr. Harris greeted us warmly. "Martha," he said, shaking my hand, "and David. Good to see you." He ushered us into his office where sunlight streamed across neat stacks of documents. David looked from me to Harris, suspicion and fatigue in his eyes. Then I opened my purse and placed the manila envelope on the desk, the same one Frank had given me before he died, the same one that had changed everything for me weeks ago. David stared at it as if it were an alien object. "What's this?" he asked. I met his eyes. The truth. Harris began pulling out the documents, deeds, bank statements, stock certificates. He explained them one by one, his voice steady, professional. I watched as David's expression shifted. Confusion first, then disbelief, then dawning realization. Finally, I handed him Frank's letter, the one written in his careful handwriting. David read it silently, lips moving with the words. His hands began to tremble. When he finished, he dropped the letter onto the desk and buried his face in his hands. "Mama," he choked out, his voice breaking. "All this time, you had this. You had money, properties, security. Why didn't you tell me? Why let me struggle like this?" His shoulders shook with sobs, the kind I hadn't heard from him since he was a boy. For a moment, my heart ached to gather him in my arms to soothe him as I once did, but I held back. This was not a wound that comfort could heal. I spoke softly, but every word carried weight. "Because David, your father, didn't work his whole life just to hand you a pile of money. He worked so you would understand the value behind it, the responsibility, the sacrifice. If I had told you too soon, you would have learned nothing. You would have seen only dollar signs, not the years of sweat they came from." He lifted his face, eyes red and wet. So this was a test. I shook my head. No, this was life, David. You chose to take shortcuts, to gamble with what wasn't yours, to believe you could buy success without building it. And you lost. But losing gave you something your father and I never could give, with words alone, a taste of humility, of real work. Now, when you look at what he left behind, you'll understand it isn't wealth you've inherited. It's duty. Silence filled the room, thick and heavy. David wiped his face, looking down at the papers again. I don't deserve any of this. No, I said gently, but you can earn it. That's the difference. In that moment, I saw my son not as the arrogant man who had betrayed me, but as the broken boy still searching for direction. And for the first time, I believed there might be hope. The ride home from Harris's office was quiet. David sat beside me, staring out the window, the weight of Frank's words still pressing on his shoulders. For once, he wasn't trying to fill the silence with excuses or plans. He was simply listening to himself, to the truth, maybe even to me. In the days that followed, something shifted. He didn't ask me for money. He kept working both jobs, bringing home his own paychecks, even if they were modest. At dinner one evening, he laid a small envelope on the table. What's this? I asked. Rent, he said, his voice steady. I know this is your house, Mom. I don't want to live here like a freeloader. Not anymore. I didn't touch the envelope. I just looked at him, the same son who once demanded, and took without hesitation, now offering back what little he had. My heart swelled with something I hadn't felt in years' respect. Over time, I began to share pieces of the responsibility Frank had left me. Bank statements, property ledgers. Harris helped explain the finer details. David listened carefully, asked questions, took notes. He was clumsy with the numbers, at first impatient with the paperwork. But he kept at it. Slowly, the arrogance that had once defined him gave way to diligence. Evelyn saw the change too. He's different now, she said one afternoon as we sat on her porch sipping iced tea. Not just humbled, grown. I nodded. For the first time, I believe Frank's lesson is taking root. One crisp autumn morning, the three of us, David, Evelyn, and I, drove back to the cabin by the lake. Harris had finalized the legal reversal, and the keys once again rested in my hand. As we stepped out of the car, the familiar scent of pine and damp earth washed over me. My chest tightened. Memories of summers past. The laughter, the bonfires, Frank's arm around my shoulder all rose at once. David walked slowly up the porch steps, running his hand along the railing Frank had built with his own hands. "Mom," he said softly, "I sold this place like it was just lumber and nails. But it's more than that. It's him. It's us." Tears pricked my eyes, but this time they weren't only from sorrow. "Yes," I whispered, "and now it will be more still." Together, we decided the cabin wouldn't simply return to being our private retreat. It would become something larger, a center for veterans and struggling families, a place of rest and support in Frank's honor. Evelyn offered to coordinate volunteers from church. David promised to put in sweat equity, repairing what he had once thrown away. As for me, I would provide the foundation, both financial and spiritual, to make it all possible. The weeks that followed were filled with hammers and paintbrushes, laughter and effort. David worked beside me, sanding floors, repairing shingles, hauling supplies. There were moments we disagreed, moments the past tried to creep back in, but each time we chose to keep moving forward. Not as mother and child locked in old roles, but as two adults building something new together. One evening, as the sun set over the water, I stood on the porch looking out across the lake. The surface glowed with streaks of gold and orange, the kind of beauty Frank used to pause and admire even after years of seeing it. I could almost hear his voice low and steady in my memory. True wealth isn't locked in a safe, Martha. It's in a heart that knows how to keep and how to give. I closed my eyes, letting the wind brush my face, and for the first time since he was gone, I felt at peace. Not because everything had been restored, but because something new had been born, something stronger, something shared. And standing there with David and Evelyn, I realized Frank had been right all along.